Nick Drake died in November 1974. He was 26 years old. At the time of his death, he had sold fewer than 20,000 records across 3 studio albums and a collection of final session recordings. To put that number in context, a modestly successful single in 1974 could sell 20,000 copies in a single afternoon. Nick Drake had sold that many records across his entire career, across 5 years of making music, across 3 albums that many people, the people who had actually heard them, considered to be among the most beautiful recordings ever made. He gave one interview in his lifetime. He performed live fewer than a dozen times after his debut album was released. He never appeared on television. He never toured. He never promoted anything. When he died, the music press barely noticed. A short paragraph in a few publications, then silence, and then, slowly at first, then all at once, the world heard him. This is the story of how that happened and what it cost to get there. In the years immediately after Nick Drake's death, his music survived because of a small number of people who refused to let it disappear. The first and most important of these was John Peel. Peel was a BBC radio DJ, perhaps the most influential music broadcaster in British history. He had a gift for finding music that nobody else was playing, and the conviction to keep playing it long after everyone else had moved on. He had been playing Nick Drake since 1969, since 5 Leaves Left was released and went almost completely unnoticed. He played him through the early 70s, through Pink Moon, through the years after Nick's death when the records were sitting in warehouse bins unsold. Peel never explained why he kept playing him. He didn't need to. The music explained itself to anyone who listened carefully enough. The second keeper was Island Records, or more specifically, Chris Blackwell, the label's founder. Blackwell had signed Nick Drake in 1968 when he was 19 years old. He had continued paying him a weekly retainer through the years when the albums sold almost nothing. He had watched Nick deteriorate and had not dropped him. Not officially, not ever. Island had simply quietly stopped the retainer payments by 1974, but the catalog remained. The records stayed in print. The masters were kept safe. This matters more than it might seem. Many labels in the 1970s would simply have deleted the catalog of an artist who sold so little. Blackwell didn't, and because he didn't, there was something to rediscover when the time came. The third group of keepers were perhaps the most important of all: Rodney and Molly Drake, Nick's parents. After Nick's death, letters began arriving at their house in Tanworth in Arden. Fan letters mostly. People who had just discovered the music and wanted to say something about it. Then interview requests from journalists. Then inquiries from researchers writing about British folk music. Rodney and Molly answered every single one, by hand, on paper, with care and patience and gratitude. For years, for decades in Molly's case, they were not promoting their son. They were not managing his legacy for commercial reasons. They simply believed that the music deserved to be heard and that the people who had found it deserved a response. Without these 3 things, Peel's radio play, Blackwell's preservation of the catalog, and the Drakes' patient correspondence, there might have been nothing left to rediscover when the world finally came looking. The first real turning point came in 1979, 5 years after Nick's death. Island Records released a box set called Fruit Tree, the complete recorded works of Nick Drake. It was a 4-record set in a plain dark box. It contained all 3 studio albums, 5 Leaves Left, Brighter Later, and Pink Moon. along with a fourth record called Time of No Reply, which included the 4 songs from the 1973 and 1974 recording sessions that had never been released. For the first time, everything Nick Drake had ever recorded professionally was available in one place. The box set came with a long essay by the American journalist Arthur Lubo. It was the first serious piece of writing about Nick Drake's life and music for a general audience. The first time someone had attempted to tell the whole story in one place. For many people who discovered the music in the late 70s and early 80s, Lubo's essay was their introduction not just to the records but to the man behind them. The title of the box set came from one of Nick's own songs, a track called Fruit Tree from the 5 Leaves Left album. The lyrics ran, "Fame is but a fruit tree, so very unsound. It can never flourish till its stock is in the ground." Nick Drake had written those words in 1968 or 1969, when he was 20 years old. He was describing something he had observed about the nature of artistic recognition, how the dead are often valued more than the living, how the work outlasts the person who made it. He could not have known he was describing his own future, or perhaps, and this is the thought that sits uneasily, he suspected it. Fruit Tree did not make Nick Drake famous overnight. The box set sold modestly to the small audience that was already paying attention. But it did something equally important. It made the complete body of work findable, permanently available, waiting for whoever came next. And for the next 15 years, that was enough. The music sat quietly in record shops and libraries, and the collections of people who knew passed from one listener to the next by word of mouth and the particular evangelism of people who have found something they cannot keep to themselves. In 1999, 4 people at an advertising agency in Boston changed everything. The agency was Arnold Worldwide. The 4 people were Shane Hutton, Alan Paffenbach, Tim Vaccarino, and a 4th colleague whose contribution was perhaps the most significant of all, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than a casual suggestion. They were working on a television commercial for the new Volkswagen Cabrio, a small, elegant convertible that Volkswagen was hoping to sell to a young, urban American market. The brief they had been given was unusual for a car commercial. They were not supposed to show the car in sunshine, going fast with attractive people having loud fun. Instead, they had been asked to capture something quieter, the specific pleasure of driving a convertible at night, under the stars, when the roads are empty and the world feels briefly manageable. It was a good brief. They had a good response to it. A 60-second film of 4 young people driving through the night, stopping at a party, deciding the drive itself was better than the destination, and turning back. They had already chosen a song. Under the Milky Way by The Church, a 1988 Australian rock song that shared some of the dreamy, nocturnal quality they were after. The commercial was provisionally titled Milky Way after the song. Then someone, one of the 4, the accounts vary on exactly who, brought a record into the office from their personal collection. It was a 1972 album called Pink Moon by a British singer-songwriter named Nick Drake. The person who brought it in had been a fan for years and thought the title track, 1 minute and 56 seconds of solo acoustic guitar and voice, recorded in 2 nights in a small London studio, might be worth trying against the footage. They played it, and it fit so perfectly and so completely, so inevitably, that nobody in the room questioned it for a second. The Church song was out. Pink Moon was in. The title of the commercial stayed as Milky Way, after the song they were no longer using. The commercial was directed by Jonathan Dayton and Valerie Faris, a directing partnership who would later make the film Little Miss Sunshine. It aired for the first time in December 1999. What happened next was unlike anything the music industry had seen before, at least not for an artist who had been dead for 25 years. Within weeks of the commercial's first broadcast, Pink Moon had entered the Amazon sales chart at number 5. Sales of the album increased by nearly 500% in the first 10 weeks of 2000 alone. Annual sales jumped from approximately 6,000 copies a year to over 74,000. Record shops began ordering Pink Moon in quantities they had never ordered before. Island Records put small stickers on the front of the CD reissue reading, "As featured in the VW ad." The stickers were undignified. They worked. A generation of people who had never heard of Nick Drake, people who had been born after his death, people for whom the 1970s British folk scene was ancient history, suddenly knew his name, suddenly owned his records, suddenly wanted more. The commercial opened a door. What came through it over the next 5 years was extraordinary. In January 1999, just before the commercial aired, BBC Two had already broadcast a 40-minute documentary called A Stranger Among Us in Search of Nick Drake. It was the first serious television documentary about his life, and it reached a substantial audience for the first time. The following year, a Dutch documentary filmmaker named Jeroen Berkvens began work on a more ambitious portrait. A Skin Too Few, The Days of Nick Drake, was 48 minutes long and told Nick's story through interviews with Joe Boyd, Gabrielle Drake, John Wood, and Robert Kirby, the producer, the sister, the engineer, and the arranger who had been closest to the music. It also contained something remarkable and previously unseen: home movie footage of Nick Drake as a child, playing on a beach with his family. A few seconds of a small boy moving, the only known footage of Nick Drake alive. For fans who had spent years staring at the same handful of Keith Morris photographs, the ones taken during the Pink Moon sessions, these few seconds were extraordinary. The film received strong reviews when it was released in 2002 and played in cinemas and on television around the world over the following years. And then in January 2005, BBC Radio 2 broadcast a documentary called Lost Boy in Search of Nick Drake. It was narrated by Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt narrating a radio documentary about a British folk musician who had sold 20,000 records in his lifetime. If you had told anyone involved in making those records in 1969 that this would happen, that one of the most famous actors in the world would one day lend his voice to the story of this quiet, difficult, brilliant young man, they would not have believed you. Joe Boyd later said that he thought Nick would have found it funny, that he would have seen the irony in it, because he had always wanted to be famous, had wanted it desperately. In fact, even if he could never bring himself to do the things that fame required. The documentary brought Nick Drake's story to an audience of millions of people who had never heard of him. Many of them went looking for the music immediately afterwards and found it waiting. The film world found Nick Drake next, and through film, he reached the generation that would carry him furthest. In 2001, Northern Sky, one of the most quietly devastating songs from the Brighter Later album, appeared in the romantic comedy Serendipity. It was an unlikely home for the song, but it introduced it to an audience of millions who would not otherwise have encountered it. In the same year, Fly, also from Brighter Later, was used by Wes Anderson in the Royal Tenenbaums. Anderson's films had a particular relationship with music. He chose songs not as background, but as architecture, as essential structural elements of the emotional experience he was building. Using Nick Drake in the Royal Tenenbaums was not a commercial decision. It was an artistic one, and it signaled to a generation of young, culturally engaged viewers that Nick Drake was someone worth knowing. Then, in 2004, One of These Things First from 5 Leaves Left appeared in Garden State, written and directed by Zach Braff, starring Natalie Portman and a young generation of actors. Garden State was the film of that particular cultural moment, introspective, melancholic, obsessively concerned with music as emotional language. Its soundtrack, which also included The Shins, Iron and Wine, and Coldplay, became one of the most discussed and shared playlists of the early internet era. For many young people who saw Garden State in 2004, Nick Drake was not a discovery they made by chance. He was recommended to them by a film they loved. And recommendations that come through things you love carry a particular weight. They stick. Each placement brought a new wave of listeners. Each wave brought more listeners still, and each new listener went looking for the albums and found 3 records waiting for them, exactly as Nick Drake had left them, unchanged, undiluted, exactly what they had always been. By 2004, Nick Drake had been dead for 30 years. In that same year, a previously unreleased track called Magic was released as a single and entered the UK singles chart at number 32. A first pressing of 5 Leaves Left, one of the few hundred copies that had sold in 1969, sold at auction for £800. A poll in Q magazine named Nick Drake the 43rd most influential musician of the 20th century, ahead of Charlie Parker, Hank Williams, and Debussy. His 3 studio albums had sold a combined total of roughly 20,000 copies in his lifetime. By the mid-2000s, they had sold millions. The number is still growing. Rodney Drake, his father, had died in 1988. He died before the Volkswagen Commercial, before the Documentaries, before Brad Pitt, before any of it. He had spent the last years of his life answering letters from the small number of people who had found the music, never knowing how many more were coming. He never saw his son become what he became. Molly Drake, his mother, lived until 1993. She saw the very beginning of the revival. She saw the letters beginning to arrive in larger numbers. She saw the music starting to find a wider audience, slowly in the years before the internet accelerated everything. But she did not see the Volkswagen commercial. She did not see Brad Pitt say her son's name on national radio. She did not see the millions of copies sold, or the film placements, or the documentaries, or the auction price for a first pressing of 5 Leaves Left. And Nick Drake saw none of it. He died 26 years before the Volkswagen commercial aired. 26 years before the world understood what he had made. 26 years before the music found the audience it had always deserved. There is a line from his own song that seems to have known all of this before it happened. Fame is but a fruit tree so very unsound. It can never flourish till its stalk is in the ground. He wrote those words as a young man. He was talking about something he had observed about fame and recognition and the cruelty of timing. But he was also, without knowing it, writing his own epitaph. The tree grew. It grew enormous in the end. It grew beyond anything anyone involved in making those records could have imagined. It just grew too late for him to sit under it. That is the story of Nick Drake. 5 videos, 1 life, 3 albums, and a handful of final recordings. and music that outlasted everything. The silence, the indifference, the 26 years of absence, and found its way to the world anyway. Always late, always worth it. The full story is on YouTube, link in bio.